Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The motion for sorry, what is the motion?
The motion is
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. The motion for today's debate is: this House believes that major tourist destinations should significantly limit the number of tourists that can visit. Representing the proposition, we have the team from Finland, and on the opposition, we have the team from Austria. From the proposition side, our speakers are: first speakers, Anya; second speaker, Madli; third speaker, Alyssa; reply speaker, Anya. On the opposition side, our speakers are: first speaker, Sophie; second speaker, Larissa; third speaker, Valentina; reply speaker, Larissa. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The first and the last minute of each speech is considered protected time, during which points of information may not be offered. The judges will signal the end of protected time at the 1 minute mark, after which POIs can be offered, and will signal the return to protected time at the 7 minute mark. At 8 minute mark, they will give a double clap or ding to signal the end of speech. Additionally, there will be 3 claps or dings at 8:15, and the judges will stop listening at 8:30. Best of luck to both teams, and now I hand over the floor to our chair judge.
I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. By limiting the number of the tourists, it is the only way to save the lives of the locals. In the best case, tourists are annoying, but in great quantities, they are a scourge to the earth. 2 arguments in the proposition case. Firstly, improving the life of the locals, and secondly, reshaping travel culture and combating climate change. Now, into the frame. We tell you, Pat, that the locals are the most important stakeholder in the debate, because they are the people that still have to live in these major tourist destinations, even when the tourists leave. They are the people that pay taxes to maintain these destinations. And they're also the people that have been building these cities throughout generations. They are, most importantly, the people that will have to stay there and deal with whatever consequences the tourists leave afterwards. Therefore, I urge the panel to care the most about locals in this debate. So now, how can we win this debate? 2 things. First, we can prove to the panel that locals are better on our side of the house. Or then we can prove to the panel that climate change is significantly combated on our side of the house. Both ways, by proving either, we will win this debate. So now into the model. We tell you that on our side of the house, we are proposing a model where tourists will have to apply for an access pass to come to these cities. They will have to pay for an access fee that these host governments can choose themselves. And this fee will then be used to maintain these destinations after these tourists leave. And there will only be a limited amount of passes that are sold within a single time frame. So now, into the first argument. So we tell you, Pam, that on our side of the house, we're directly improving the life of the locals. What do we mean by this? 3 parts in this argument. Firstly, we're telling you that we're directly reducing the disturbance of locals. What do we mean by this? We tell you that in excessive amounts of these tourists, they are flooding restaurants, they're flooding streets, they're flooding bars, they're flooding every single part of the city. This makes the lives of the locals extremely hard, because it's very hard for me to get to a hospital, for example, to see my mother, if there's an excessive amount of crowd near the Colosseum, and I have to get through the Colosseum to the hospital. It's not convenient for the locals. It's not great for the locals. Moreover, these tourists leave a significant amount of trash and litter and all kinds of disposable material behind. Moreover, they also consume much more than these locals. They consume much more plastic. They consume 6 times the amount of water than the locals consume. And this is not sustainable for these major tourist destination cities. Moreover, there is noise. There's significantly more noise with overcrowdings, with just, the people walking through the streets or the crowds shouting when they see the Eiffel Tower because it's just so great for them. And even, no thank you, and even if we do not take these examples into consideration. Just because I live in an apartment building and my rich neighbor landlord is renting their apartment continuously to tourists, when they continuously rent their Airbnb to tourists that do not care about regulation, that party every single night, it's very hard for me as a student to study for my medical school entrance exam. We tell you that all of these are directly reduced on our side of the house because just by limiting the sheer quantity of tourists that visit, all of these problems are already significantly reduced on our side of the house. But now, secondly, we're also reducing the indirect harms that these tourists cause to these major tourist destinations. We tell you that these tourists, with their sheer quantity, they are directly pushing up the prices of all services. This means, for example, food prices, gas, every single thing that you can imagine are gone up because there's so many of these tourists in these places that, everyone can just charge so much more. But we tell you that this still does not benefit the locals, even if opposition tells you that. Why? We tell you that the only people that are actually benefiting from these are already the wealthy. We tell you that it's only the rich landlords, those who have owned this property for already 100 years, or big international or regional corporations. It's only these three kinds of people that actually benefit from them because they already own this property in these major, tourist destinations. They have property there and they can rent them with extremely high prices to these local businesses. We tell you that these people will rent with a high price, and this makes the people who actually, are in these places, these local business owners, they have to sell at an extremely, with a significantly higher price if they want to make any kind of return or profit from this. And this, again, makes the lives of those who don't do this much harder because you have to now pay at a much higher price, but you don't have this because you are a local. And we tell you that only tourists are able to do this because they are only temporary. They come for a fixed amount of 1-2 days. They're able to afford this because they think that, okay, I'm going to pamper myself for 2 days, pay a bit more. It doesn't matter for them, but it matters for these locals that have to stay there when, even when the tourists leave. Yes?
There's always limited overlap in high demand goods for locals, which means the prices for those who are not spiking due to tourists.
That is not true in the status quo. The status quo is so that these tourist destinations, these cities are flooded with tourists everywhere. There's no local or tourist quarter because all of this is a tourist quarter. Everywhere in the city, there's so much demand from the tourists that all of the prices are spiked up. And moreover, we also tell you that this problem manifests even more when you look at housing prices. Because I already gave you the example of people renting more and more Airbnbs because they know that hotels cannot accommodate, they simply cannot accommodate all of the people that want to go to Paris, that want to go to Rome, that want to go to Venice. It's simply they know that they can rent more and more Airbnbs at limited amount of time. It's for them it's even more profitable to maybe keep them for a few days without anyone living there than they are able to do that and still rent at a much higher price because when they know when someone rents it, it's so much more profitable this way than to rent for a longer period of time for a local. I tell you that on our side of the house, these problems are significantly less. And thirdly, we also tell you that we're preserving identity and cultural heritage. We tell you that on our side of the house, we're directly reducing the harm caused to, natural sites like we see in France, we have the Lascaux caves, where that had to be closed, they had to be shut down because the enormous amount of tourists that visited day in, day out, because the excessive carbon dioxide that caused, the humidity of people, the human-caused erosion. These are all factors that, that simply cannot be reduced through other measures. And there's also, not to mention, vandalism, trashing, littering, taking pieces of these natural sites. And this this cannot be reduced with any other means. This cannot simply be done by, adding more police, because there's so many people. One police or a few more police won't do anything. We tell you that only by reducing the number of people can we actually do something. If it is, for example, humidity or excessive carbon dioxide. And our side of the house, we tell you that it's extremely important for the locals because they have value to them. If I'm a person who grew up every day walking past the Eiffel Tower. Every day, all of my childhood memories are attached to this one place. When this place represents part of my national identity or something that I have national pride towards, it is not fair for these locals to be ripped away from this. And even if you don't believe that this is beneficial for the locals, we also give you this alternative point of view, that this is also beneficial for the tourists if you keep good care about them. We tell you that tourists will want to come as long as the Eiffel Tower is there, as long as the Eiffel Tower is in good condition and on their side of the house, because they do not want to limit, because they do nothing to stop the deterioration of these. Tourists will, in the future, not even want to come to these places, and therefore, even whatever beneficial economic impacts that they are providing will not happen. So now, to summarize, 3 parts in my speech that I've told you. First, here we're reducing direct harms to these locals: noise, overcrowding, traffic jams, everything. Secondly, we are pushing down the prices because we're making these economies reshape around locals and not the prices that tourists give. And thirdly, we're also giving them back the right to these natural sites, and therefore, life is better on our side of the house. I urge the panel to vote for us. Thank you so much. So proud to be here.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we on side of don't limit the people, we limit harms. In my speech, I will bring up 2 major arguments: why there's no alternative industry, and second, why this will lead to mass unemployment and economic regression. And in our second speech, will be explained how this motion leads to massive loss of current and future infrastructure. But first, some responses regarding the quality of tourists versus the quantity of tourists. On our side, we still can have and likely will have regulations and incentives for tourists to behave well. These also rebut all of your points. Note, panel, that the proposition cannot claim we have no regulations on our side of the house. We simply do not regulate the number of tourists, which does not mean we do not regulate certain behaviors. In the status quo, we see that regulation of behaviors is happening. A, Barcelona is banning Airbnbs, which rebuts all their point about housing prices. B, as we have seen in Copenhagen and Japan, they are offering perks like free lunches for tourists who use public transportation, who participate in cleanup activities, or support local businesses. Also rebuts the whole environment part. D, or we see that they are limiting the hours where alcohol can be bought to reduce bad behavior. E, we also see that there are stricter regulations and are being implemented, and there are increases fines for littering or damaging cultural sites, which are directly used for restoration or upkeep the very same. So these regulations are voting issues and popular among locals, which is the reason they are implemented. Moving up to my first argument, the lack of viable alternative industries. We see this because of geographic constraints. Most of these countries simply do not have anything else to offer. So they have no minerals to mine, they have infertile land, they have mountain regions that are hard to access. Prop would need to explain why any shift is feasible, and most countries would have the geographical ability. So second, there's no incentives for companies to establish themselves in these regions. A, in many countries you have comparatively higher tax rates and workers' rights. For example, Ireland, which is a tech hub and has very low tax rates compared to any other European country or Asian country. B, therefore, it is very easy for companies to move to a place where they don't pay taxes, like Ireland, for example, or Bangladesh, where you don't have any workers' rights. So in countries like Italy, it is way harder to establish yourself. Our third point is investor trust. Because there were tourism-specific investment, you have first a lack of high-speed internet, you have lack of heavy-duty roads, and you prioritize easy and quick to build roads for tourist purposes. You have lack of industrial ports because beaches were prioritized. 4, you have localized skills and knowledge gap. Highly specialized workforce which needs to be re-educated to fit in a new industry. The workforce in these tourist-centric regions has developed skills specifically tailored to the tourism industry. Tour guides, hotel managers, and cultural event coordinators possess skills that are directly tied to local tourism. So, there is a lack of knowledge for new sectors. They're developing alternative industries would require new skills and expertise that the local population currently lacks, for example, programming, mining, or fishing. This is expensive and relies on the cooperation of the local people, which is not guaranteed. We believe the fear of economic instability further harms the willingness and the ability of individuals to invest in learning skills. This means even if taxes and workers' rights would not be the problem, the local infrastructure and population will. We think it is unlikely that government should be able to attract and lobby companies and investors to move there. Historically, they are a huge competitive disadvantage against other countries who have worked on these relationships for decades, and also they have way less to offer them because infrastructure, as I already mentioned, wasn't built and the knowledge was focused on tourism. This means that investors are not going to want to invest before these accommodations are built, and without investment, it is unlikely they will be able to build them, because at the same time, the tourist countries are missing out on their biggest income, which is tourism. Especially if we look at the investment on a comparative, we are losing out on massive amounts of money. Currently, there's high investor trust in these regions because they have huge amounts of people coming in and the direction is increasing. Before I move up to my second argument, I will take you one. All right. Argument 2, massive unemployment and economic regression. How does this happen? We have direct job losses. The tourism industry directly employs millions in sectors such as hospitality, transportation, and retail. Significantly reductions in numbers means significant amount of people will lose their jobs. There are less customers, less visitors, and less clients. So we also have indirect job losses because tourism supports numerous of other industries such as agriculture, this means food supplies for restaurants, and manufacturing goods for tourists. The loss of tourism would ripple through the supply chain. Also, third point is financial burden on the state. We would have massive unemployment benefits and business support needed. The state would need to provide unemployment benefits to displaced workers and provide previous business owners. This would strain public finances. This would require reallocating budget, resources, and impacting public services like healthcare and education. This is especially bad. At the same time, you significantly limit the biggest income source of the government, which is tourism. So, then we have a psychological and social impact, the fear and uncertainty. Even a slow implementation of tourist limits would create fear and uncertainty among the local population, undermining confidence in economic stability. This is crucial because the development of new industries is dependent on people spending money on this new industry and supporting its development. Why will this not be the case? People fear the unknown. They have worked in tourism for decades. Their whole family is specialized in it. This means when the government passes this policy, they will fear for their existence even if the government promises unemployment benefits or other compensation. First, people are often mistrustful of politicians and promises because they rarely keep them. Second, also they cannot imagine how else the government could get money if not through tourism. This leads to people behaving extremely risk-averse, and they will only spend money on their very basic necessaries because they are saving money for hard times to come. This includes additional education. So note that the basic for economic growth is that people are willing to spend money on goods and services. The more people spend, the more money is circulated and added to the economy. This means that people can have jobs and pay employees. If the amount of money is now significantly restricted because we limit tourism significantly, people start hoarding and saving money rather than spending. This leads to a nationwide regression. This means even if some other industry was planned to develop, it will not be able to do so because people will be unwilling to spend money on goods and services from that industry. And investors will not want to invest in a regressive economy because it is extremely unstable environment. That has been proud to oppose.
Is opposition ready? Yes, is panel ready? Wonderful. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, something that we feel is very important to note here on Team Proposition is that the reason why we are talking about this motion right now, the reason why we are talking about limiting the amount of tourists that can visit these major tourist destinations is because of the fact that in status quo we are facing over-tourism, which is something that Team Opposition doesn't seem to want to acknowledge. The problem right now that we are facing is that there are far too many people going to these places. Yes, these major tourist destinations rely heavily on tourism. However, right now, the reason why so many people and so many locals are why these tourists are facing backlash from locals is because of the fact that there's far too many of them. They have created so much. They have created so many problems. They have created so much erosion. They have created so much disturbance within these cities that the locals simply cannot live their life. And even if the major cities do get some amount, of profits from it, at this point, it is far too unsustainable, not only for these cities, but also for the environment. And that is why we here in Team Proposition are so happy to propose. So, first of all, in my speech, I will firstly be going over a bit of rebuttal. And then going into our second substantive, which is reshaping travel culture and combating climate change through that. So, first of all, when it comes to Team Opposition, they are quite clearly heavily focused on the economies of these major cities and the economies of these countries, right? Understandably so, because it seems like if you were to limit tourists majorly, then these cities would face immense amounts of problems, especially when it comes to something like job loss. However, we here in Team Proposition do not believe that is true. Number one, they claim that with limiting the amount of tourists that come in, a lot of people who invested their skills and time into tourism would then have to leave the industry. However, that is not true because of what I noted earlier, which is that we are facing over-tourism, not just tourism. We are not just limiting tourism, we are limiting over-tourism because right now it is unsustainable. The reason why we do not believe that there will be major economic job loss is due to the fact that these industries can still exist. These industries can still exist and thrive mainly due to the fact that there will still be many tourists, right? There will still be millions amount of tourists to these major tourist destinations because even though we are limiting them, we have to remember that we are talking about tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who are coming into these places. Yes, we are significantly limiting them, but even having the amount of tourists that come in, we remind you, this still means that there's tens of millions of people coming into these places, right? Not to mention that with these limitations, what we also believe in Team Proposition is that it will incentivize people to not only come during peak tourist times, but also year-round. Not to mention
that one of the problems, team opposition claims that you do not have to limit the amount of people that come in and say that you can instead regulate behavior. However, we do not believe that is mutually exclusive to team opposition. We here can limit the amount of tourists and still regulate behavior as well. That is not something that is exclusive to their side, and thus we would disagree with their, and thus that is why we are still so heavily in our approach of limiting the amount of tourists that come into these destinations. And so I will now start on our substantive. So our second argument is that is reshaping travel culture and combating climate change. So what will tourists do now that there are these major restrictions? Like, what will happen? We here in Team Proposition have identified approximately three types of travelers. Number one, those who will go anyway to these major tourist destinations, right? Number two, those who will go somewhere else, either within the country or within some other country or within their own country. And three, those who simply will not go. Number one, those who will go anyways. We have to remember that despite the fact that these restrictions still exist, despite the fact that we are putting restrictions on, people can still go to these locations. We have to remember the example of Venice, right? Venice has implemented these restrictions, but there's still millions amount of tourists who go there every day, who go there at all times, right? Simply because we are limiting the amount of tourists doesn't mean that they won't go. Not to mention that because we have this entrance fee, which Team Opposition doesn't seem to want to talk about, it means that we can still uphold the economy of the city, and we can still help these tourists. We can still help these tourist industries, and they will still get their money. Not to mention that with this entrance fee, we can also ensure that these major cultural sites can uphold themselves, that they have the money to invest into themselves so that they are not eroded due to the amount of tourists that go there. Not to mention that now that there is no more over-tourism, now that there is no more overcrowding, these natural sites and these very important cultural artifacts can stay, and that they can stay and they will not be eroded due to the massive amount of people that go there every day. For example, when it comes to the Greek islands, a very big problem with the Greek islands right now is that their vineyards are slowly dying, right? Because there's simply so many people going there every day. There's simply so many people who are visiting these sites every day. And it is estimated that by 2045, the Greek islands will no longer have vineyards simply because of the fact that there's so many tourists that go there all the time, who stomp on those places, who stomp on them, make the soil worse, and generally do not let the vineyards breathe, right? Which is not just destroying the natural beautiful sites of these islands, but also destroying a wine industry. That is why we believe that it's so important to limit these tourists. Then, when we look at the people who go somewhere else, right? Team Opposition is very worried about the economic loss that may happen from this. However, we remind you, panel, that we are only talking about major tourist destinations. Now that people cannot or do not want to go to these major tourist destinations, they can still go to other places in the country. They can still go to smaller towns. They can still travel to other places, meaning that even if they do not go to Paris, they can go to other places in France. A lot of people want to go to Paris because it's French, right? Because they see it as the French capital, because they see it as the culture capital of France. However, now that they might not want to go to these places because of these restrictions, it's still very possible that those people who wanted to go to Paris because it's French culture will still be interested in going to other places in France, meaning that these jobs that Team Opposition is so worried about can simply continue in these smaller locations, which will now also have more tourists in them. Then, when it comes to the group 3 type of people, who simply will not go, we believe that yes, while it is very important to talk about these cities and the major economic impacts that happens within these cities, we also believe that one of the major things that we have to talk about is the fact that climate change is ever getting worse, right? Climate change is only worsening. And what we have to do is try and combat it in any way that we can. And something that we have to remember is that in order to make big change, we first have to take small steps, right? And we believe that limiting the amount of people who can go to these tourist destinations, limiting travel in general, is a very good way of taking that first step. Because one of the major reasons of climate change is due to the fact that we are simply, is that we are consuming too much, we are spending too much, we are living these extravagant lives without thinking about what it does to the ecosystem, without thinking about what it does to these areas. And this small change of limiting who can go can in the future lead to bigger precedents. Not to mention that this small change is fixing a massive issue for locals, right? As we talked about within our first speech, it is fixing the problem of overcrowding. It is fixing the problem of these places being too expensive. It is fixing the problem of locals not being able to properly live their lives in these cities where they grew up, in these cities in which they pay taxes to, in these cities in which they have so much emotional attachment to. We believe that this is one of the best ways in order to ensure that not only these cities have the best upkeep for themselves, but also that the locals can stay within their communities and can have this national pride within their beautiful places. And because of all these reasons, we are so happy to propose, because we believe that even with these small steps, we can make big changes. And even with these small steps, we can do so much good within the world, not only for these cities, for locals, but also for the environment. Thank you. We limit harms. Let me start my speech with a lot of rebuttal before I go into my own. First, rebuttal on how you don't think unemployment will happen because they won't leave the industry. You significantly have less tourists because you limit them. This means you have significantly less workers. These major destinations heavily rely on the tourism sector, and the millions of tourists they are missing will also result in millions of workers being now unemployed, which is a huge harm to these locals you characterize as the most vulnerable, important stakeholder. So, you also point out that your entrance fee is enough for the economy, but you agree that millions of tourists are less on your side, so how high would your entrance fee have to be? 1,000,000 times as high? This is just simply unrealistic on your side, and you are not facing the economical harms that my first speaker has mentioned quite thoroughly. Second of all, I think you agree that regulations can mitigate many of the harms. Then why would you voluntarily face the huge economic harms of significantly limiting the tourism if you could also mitigate these harms with the regulations and penalties for violation, or like reward programs for good behavior that we have mentioned in our speech? Second point of rebuttal on the pricing being spiked by mass tourism. I told you in my POI this is simply untrue, and locals are actually profiting from charging more to the tourists because the spheres where tourists and citizens compete for services is limited. What do I mean? First of all, different consumption patterns lead to limited overlap in high demand goods. For example, tourists don't buy significant quantity of basic good or utilities, but rather go to like fancy restaurants, souvenirs, and local artifacts. So there's no shortage in the goods the locals actually need, which means the price stays quite constant for them. Second of all, in the rare cases they do compete, as you mentioned, housing and transport, there are easy implementations on our side taken to separate the competition. First of all, differentiated dual pricing systems, where, for example, citizens and local students have passes in public transport to pay less. Politicians that implement this, as my first speaker has explained, are extremely popular, which means this issue will be likely solved through voting. Second of all, tourists just pay more for attractions like fish markets in Barcelona, taxis, restaurants in Asia, or Thailand's national parks, which means the revenue is reinvested in the same industry, so the infrastructure or the buses or the drivers are just upgraded so the locals aren't harmed because this balances out due to the more money they get from the tourists. Furthermore, tourists prefer convenience, so they will opt for like private transport options like a rental car, and this reduces the strain on public transport, so there's not really an overlap. On the housing issue, tourists often seek accommodations near major attractions, not in the residential areas, so this is not an actual problem. Second of all, if too much overlap happens, measures will be taken, as we see in Barcelona banning Airbnb, and the government will likely implement schemes to offer like registered housing offers for the tourists, so they can again control the accessibility and pricing and free up housing for the locals. So this is once again mitigated. And even in the worst case, where locals now have to like drive a bit further to get to like the next big local store, the money and benefits they earn from selling to all these high volumes of mass tourists more expensively just simply outweighs this minor possible harm. Now, on the point of like vulnerable like locals, we have to focus on where the delta is between mass tourism and your side of tourism. On your side, you have basically exclusively large chains like the Crown Plaza, Hilton, McDonald's that still exist because of market dominance and economies of scale. Comparatively, on our side, we additionally have support and opportunity for small and family-run businesses, hotels, and restaurants. Why is this? First of all, the spillover effect. When major hotels are crowded, fully booked, or too expensive due to high demand, tourists turn to smaller local businesses. This only happens with tourism because of this high threshold. Second one, economies of scale. Chains offer competitive prices and consistent quality, which small businesses can simply not match without the high volume of tourists frequenting their stores and restaurants and hotels every day. Third of all, the extended tourism reach, which leads to infrastructure improvements and economic growth in the proximity, which extends beyond the major destinations to nearby smaller towns and coastal areas, as we see in Dubrovnik, where the tourists also go to see the surrounding coastline, but still have Dubrovnik as the main incentive to go there in the first place. Third of all, reductions in mass urban migration that happen due to this, because the establishment of transport lines to these surrounding areas reduces the need and burden for residents to migrate to urban centers in order for better opportunities. So they can commute easily, and the spillover effect also gives them jobs in more places. And these points specifically address your most vulnerable stakeholder. You think the problem for them is overcrowding, but the problem is poverty and unemployment that you cause on your side. Now, on your point on environmental destruction. First of all, if tourism exists on both sides, how does the shift in environmental improvement happen on your side? This is the quality versus quantity thing again, where we explain to you that we have regulations that specifically address the biggest harms that tourists cause. And on the other hand, we have the resources due to the tax revenue from tourism and incentive to enforce better environmental sustainability, because we also want to make this place nicely livable for locals and tourists. Now, rebuttal on limits being beneficial for tourists. This is simply not true because, first of all, on scale, you are excluding so many of them from even visiting. Second of all, it's not beneficial because you lack the high volume of tourist revenue, which is necessary to establish and invest and maintain the infrastructure, which I will go into my argument. And then it is just simply more important for the locals. Last point of rebuttal I want to go into before I go into my argument is the culture point. First of all, there's the incentive to keep the culture because it makes it attractive both for tourists and locals. Second of all, we need the money get generated from tourism to maintain and even live out this culture. For example, Mexico's cultural festivals where tourists and locals can enjoy this side by side, but the locals need the money from tourism to even live and be able to enjoy this. Now, onto my argument why massive loss of infrastructure for current infrastructure and future projects happen. Well, we're losing the tax revenue that is exclusive to tourism because, first of all, they majorly rely on tourism in these destinations, and second of all, due to the inherent locality of tourism, which means that they cannot relocate to avoid taxes because they're just specifically located there. And tourism just simply has a high tax revenue because there are so various channels: hotel taxes, overnight fees, sale taxes on goods and services, and entry fees to attractions. So this is not a one-time thing as your access fee, but rather the tourists every day going for breakfast, lunch, dinner, a hotel, and buying some expensive souvenirs on the way. So what will the impact be on your side? You simply have the loss of investment as well as the loss of tax revenue and thereby reduced government funding. My first speaker has already explained to you why this is detrimental to the people facing unemployment because the government no longer has the budget and the funds to help them. And second of all, how this leads to them being super scared and insecure to join any other sectors, even though these other sectors are unlikely to happen anyway due to all the reasons why tourism is exclusive to these places. But going on to deeper into my argument. Yes, please.
As a speaker, they're not so dependent on tourism because they don't deteriorate during off-season.
Of course they are. Major tourist destinations are major tourist destinations. This means they are majorly and significantly reliant on tourism to fund them and to make them that is their main income area. So where does this income lead to? This income currently is being used for infrastructure development because mass tourism necessitates improvements for infrastructure, roads, airports, electricity, and Wi-Fi lines, as well as sanitation and waste. As well as healthcare and emergency. You mentioned that crowded hospitals are a problem, but at least we have hospitals on our side because tourism is generating the money to actually build these things in the first place. Second of all, tourism is an incentive for enhanced safety measures because the incentive is, on the one hand, the locals want to protect their national heritage and they want a positive reputation for more tourists to come, and they have the capability, due to the tax revenue from tourism that we have exclusively on our side, on this scale. The result is they hire more police officers, install surveillance cameras, and improve emergency response services. All of these benefits are also accessible to the locals due to the spillover effect I mentioned, simply to the state funding having a higher budget, the auxiliary industry, trickle-down effect, and the spaces for progress being established because we have the money to at least establish the spaces that they can then build on later on. The alternative on your side is not better, and restricting tourism will significantly slow such development and hinder overall progress in the whole region. We don't limit people, we limit harms.
Okay, so I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the main question in this debate is life of locals is actually better on our side of the house than their side of the house, right? I'm gonna start with talking about businesses that we addressed in the first speeches, and then I'm gonna move to the point of massive unemployment, and then point to which they didn't really engage about the harms that tourists are actually causing to the locals that live in the area, right? Firstly, businesses. They told us that if we limit these major tourist destinations with the amount of tourists, right, businesses are going to pull out. Investors don't want to come in just because their amount of revenue is not as big as they would like it to be. There is no incentive for them to come invest, develop the economy, right? That's what they told us. We told you that, firstly, businesses are going to seek a field, and businesses are going to readapt. Maybe it is now that investors don't come in the status quo for any other field in these countries but the tourism field, purely because the tourism is the main field that is profit giving. Maybe if we limit these major tourist destinations, we are going to finally get proper services, proper businesses that serve locals to the main part, right? Yes. First thing. Secondly, we told you that tourism is still in place. We told you that, yes, we're significantly limiting the amount of tourists. We are. However, firstly, amount of tourists is still there. If we limit even half of the people who come to Italy every single year, it's still 25 million of people per year. It's a huge amount of people. It's a huge amount of products, services that they pay for every single year, right? That's the first thing. Second thing. I forgot what is my second thing. Yes.
Isn't it simply less tourists means less shops for the people?
No, not necessarily, because now all of the shops are catered specifically toward tourists. When these tourists go away, there is incentive for these businesses to actually benefit locals who are be more creative and create competition based on that. Right? Yes. So, yes, they said that, well, because these businesses have amazing tax revenue and what they're giving to these governments, we are going to lose on our side of the house based on economic disadvantage that we are putting ourselves in. And we tell you that not. Because we told you in our first speech where the money goes. We told you in our first speech that the economic development does not mean economic growth. People do not feel good in the status quo. People are not benefiting more from the tourist destinations. They said it right in their previous speech. These people are poor, these people are unemployed, and this is because state does not care for them. They do just develop the area of tourism, forgetting about the services for locals, about their well-being. Yes?
On your side, the state doesn't have the funds to finance these people, and the people are massively unemployed because there's less tourists. How are they not happy there?
I'm going to address the point of unemployment right now. Right? So we tell you that their point of unemployment is unreasonable. Well, firstly, because these people still have off seasons, and country is bigger than just that major tourist destination. They are not going to die off. Even if it is a slight decrease, it's not as bad as we think it is. Secondly, I already told you that businesses have incentive to reshape. They cater toward locals instead, provide more creative, better services. No, thank you. We told you, we are telling you that these places are generally places that are less developed, and therefore, by limiting the amount of tourists that come in, it is an incentive to develop these places, employ people in a different way. This is why Helsinki does not have problem with not having huge amount of tourists pouring in, but some Venice does, because they are having worse infrastructure, worse development, and the fact that businesses are profit driven, that businesses and government wants to pull everything out of the tourism. That's the reason why these people stay poor on their side of the house. They don't allow that change to happen. They are poisoning life of locals and poisoning the environment, ruining the nature. No, thank you. Yes. So, about life of locals, right? We told about our regulations and about how they cannot be sufficient on their side of the house. Why? Firstly, because even if you can limit the amount of how people, let's say, touch the Great Wall in China, and therefore somehow protect it from the damage, they still cannot possibly manage the over-tourism factor that is there. It is a huge amount of tourists. You can put police on every single corner, and because of the amount of tourists, they are still going to be incapable of doing so. This is the status quo. This is where they are incapable now to address these issues. They are incapable to regulate these major tourist destinations so that locals don't complain about these tourists being noisy, being loud, being dirty, being so disrespectful towards everything that exists in their country, right? We tell you that the housing problem is still present. Some countries are trying to, get it solved, but firstly, it's profit. We told you that because tourism does bring profit, and these countries don't want to reap that profit away. The only incentive for them to further develop is to take it away and make sure that they have an incentive to further develop their economy, to grow their economy, not to just bring more money and spend it on nothing, right? Yes. Yes.
How will there be money for any other sector to improve and to provide a good life for the citizens if they don't have the money from the tourism?
Well, because we told you that businesses are likely to reshape. Because we tell you that when there is not that big bunch of people that you have to serve, you have energy and resources to actually develop your own country, your own economy. Because this is what state is supposed to do. We are meant to care for our locals. We are meant to care for people who pay taxes, who have their home in the country. We are meant to care for these people. We are meant to build workplaces, not based on some tourism, etc., but stable economy that is capable of providing for them even in the times of crisis. No, thank you. If their characterization is so right, and yes, the significant reduction of the tourism is gonna lead to absolutely horrible unemployment, right? How are we doing in the times of crisis? How are we doing in times of COVID? When they were incapable of modifying their economy, they did not care for it because they were getting this money. We told you that we are getting these economic benefits on our side of the house. Yes, so benefits for local in this debate. We tell you that less tourism means that these people are having just pure environment, less pollution. They can walk freely on the streets without being afraid of these crowds, loud, disrespectful, etc. We told you about that because of the amount of tourists, the demand for certain products, demand for cafes and restaurants is so high that people, the businesses who are profit-driven, can price them as high as they want, and that locals are driven away from city centers. They're driven from the cities to the countryside to live there purely because Airbnb is more beneficial for those who than serving locals on a long term, right? We told you about less pollution. We told you about the situations when dolphins came back to Venice because of the amount of people. Because amount of people was significantly reduced, right? We told you that these are the benefits. We want to serve our locals because they are the ones who are paying taxes. They are the ones who are being constantly disrespected in the status quo, and we must protect them. Yes, thank you.
I need 1 second for my mic, please. Panel, please note the majority of the stuff we have heard from the side of proposition was criticizing the quality of tourists, not the quantity of tourists. The proposition coming in and saying, well, some tourists are disrespectful and some tourists like litter or stuff. This is absolutely not contingent on how many tourists there are, right? Even if there are only a few tourists, this could still happen. So really what they're criticizing is the quality of tourists, not the quantity. And we're also telling you that what we fix on our side of the house is the quality of tourists, right? We've given you multiple explanations throughout our speeches as to how, it's 30 seconds, as to how, through measurements of certain regulations, we improve the quality of these tourists, because due to all these tourists coming in, we now do have significantly more money to employ people to check on these tourists, to make sure that they're not littering, right? So really, what the delta of this debate is, where do we get better quality? And really, at this point, Proposition's case is not standing on quantity anymore, right? Now, let me do a little bit of rebuilding of our case. They basically, no thank you, they basically said that the industry still exists, meaning you get no job losses. But let's think about this a little bit realistically in terms of mathematics. If at the moment I have a city where there are 5 million tourists coming in every year, and I have maybe 3 million people working in the tourism sector, and now they limit it to only maybe 500,000 people coming in every year, I still have 300 million people who currently work in the tourism sector. What happens to, and we don't need that many people to work for just a very limited amount of tourists. So yes, these people do lose their jobs on a very, very high scale, right? Then they're calling cultural artifacts. We tell you that in order to keep cultural artifacts nice, you need money. And in order to have people coming into the cultural artifacts to keep them nice, to give you money, you have to keep them nice. Meaning this is a cycle of we get money to make them nice, so that they're nice, so that we get money, right? This is a very logical cycle that's a current thing that's always happening, right? They also said that businesses adapt, and sure, this might happen for a very, very limited amount of businesses who are already there, okay, fine. But if we're looking at really, really profitable big businesses, if they can choose between establishing themselves in New York City, where there's a bunch of infrastructure for these types of industries to happen, where they have a far more ready workforce, because we have far more computer scientists in New York, no thank you, than in the countryside in Croatia, it's far more likely that they will go to the place where they can have far more benefits than to a small place in Croatia where they would have to adapt for 5 years in order for it to maybe work at one point, right? So on scale, maybe some go there, but this is nothing compared to the tourism we currently get that's financing literally the entire healthcare system of some countries, right? And we also literally have no analysis as to how this sort of development would happen, right? They also talk a lot about tourists being really, really disrespectful and whatever, and we're telling you that a lot of these things are voting issues, right? If you have tourists who do really, really disrespectful stuff, who intrude your space, what's likely is that some politicians will realize, oh yeah, that's pretty convenient for me to get votes if I just want to restrict, no thank you, this specific behavior, right? Meaning politicians are likely to campaign for this, and the ones who do campaign for this are likely to get votes. So at this point, it becomes a voting issue. They also talk about COVID and about how tourism collapsed during COVID, and we tell you, sure, it did, but so did the entire world economy, right? And tourism was the first sector to recover after COVID. Why? Because we locked people in their houses for 2 years, and if you've been locked in your house for 2 years, likely the first thing you want to do is experience the freedom of movement again and go somewhere and be a tourist, right? Which is why at the moment, even though COVID was only 3 years ago, if my math is correct, we still now have an amazing tourism sector, because tourism bounces back so quickly because it doesn't require a lot of investment in order for it to be profitable, because all this infrastructure already existed, right? Now, for some rebuttal on their competition of infrastructure, first of all, we're telling you that for the most part, spheres resistance and tourists compete for products is very, very limited. And in terms of transport, for example, politicians are already in the status quo on our side of the house, giving out benefits to locals, making transport a lot cheaper for locals than for tourists. And as they actually have said, if you're a tourist, you probably want to splurge on vacation, meaning you're not likely to stuff yourself into a metro, but to actually take a taxi, meaning if you as a person need to, if as a local need public transport, it likely won't be crowded by tourists as much. When it comes to housing, we're telling you that how tourism happens is first people decide where they want to go, and then they look for accommodation, right? Reason why people go to Venice is first of all because they want to see just Venice, and then they Google the opportunities. If we do not have Airbnbs, it is likely that the government will have schemes where you have to register these houses officially, which is already happening, right? So even if you want to rent this out, there will be additional taxes, and it will be far more regulated in price. This has two potential impacts. First of all, it's either that less people are ready to go for this, but even if a lot of people go for this, at least we have more money to invest in local people actually benefiting from this as well, right? Then their entire point on environment and vandalism. They talked about you take stones, no thank you, from the wall of China or something, and we're telling you, look, right now, sure, maybe some people do this, but right now if you go to China, it's nice, but it's not super exclusive. Now if we limit the amount of people who can visit the Great Wall of China, going there becomes so much more exclusive. And you're so much cooler if you can say, oh, look, I went there, meaning the incentive for you to proof that you actually were there by taking a stone is so much higher than in the status quo where a bunch of people do this and you're not so special because you went to China, right? And we have far more money now, meaning it's far easier to have resources and personnel to supervise these tours. And if they really care about the environment, they have to explain why on their side of the house anything is better for the environment. Because although they have still not managed to prove that there will be any alternative industry to prevent this mass unemployment, let's say they would actually have done this, then they would still not have been able to prove why any other industry is better, right? Look, how is mining good for the environment? How is animal agriculture good for the environment? It is absolutely not. And if a lot of jobs are dependent on any other industry, like for example mining, it is very hard to bring in regulations like making mining more eco-friendly. However, with tourism, it is very, very easy to make minor adjustments, like for example, offering people free lunch so that they help in beach cleanups, which is far harder to do in any other industry, right? And we're telling you that countries already have preemptive measures, like rewarding tourists for being for clean up or something. And even if only 1% opts in because of the scale we get in our side of the house, that's still a lot of people who are doing positive stuff, like for example, beach cleanups, right? So at worst, the environment is symmetric on both sides of the house. At best, it's better on our side of the house, right? And now, yes.
You could not consider cases like in France where the last place were actually closed because of actually quantity of tourists that came in and caused erosion, humidity, and carbon dioxide excessiveness.
Look, a lot of this stuff is just generally caused by climate change, which is not completely exclusive to tourism. And secondly, in cases where it's really, really so bad, again, we have our other regulations, like erosion, we just put policemen there and tell the tourists, hey, please don't litter, which is easier to do on our side of the house, because now we actually have more capital in order to finance this sort of surveillance. And now the delta of this debate is that the side of proposition has still not managed to justify this ban. So what they've told me is, okay, some tourists are disrespectful. Look, we agree. What we're telling you, what needs to happen here is we need to regulate disrespectful behavior. What the proposition has still not managed to do is they have still not managed to prove why we actually need a ban. And this is what they should have done in this debate in their side of the house, and this is what they have failed to do and what they therefore lose this debate on. Now, for some weighing, we're telling you that we are protecting the most vulnerable stakeholders, like small businesses, which has been explained in my second speaker's speech, because of the spillover effect, which does not happen on their side of the house, because on our side of the house, you have Crown Plaza, but you also have local business. On their side of the house, you only have Crown Plaza, because there's no need for local business, because Crown Plaza is not as expensive as it is on our side of the house. We're also telling you that on scale, the large scale of tourists allows for so much monetary gain, which contributes so much to the local economy, right? On proposition, the severity of impact is so much worse because workers do lose jobs and people are not willing to spend money, as pointed out in the first speech, meaning all the areas of the economy suffer. So if you stand with people, environment, and economy, you stand with opposition.
Let me go through some weighing on our main clashes and explain to you how we basically win all of them. First of all, on local life quality and how these are like the most vulnerable stakeholders. On your side, you basically portray these locals as having the biggest problem of noise disturbances and seeing tourists too often. You solve this by unemployment and poverty. On our side, we explain to you that we have regulation, and the technology and revenue created to implement things like surveillance and like enforcing these laws to make sure that tourists behave better, and thereby the locals no longer have to complain about these disturbances, but rather benefit from the locals going to their stores and buying stuff every second hour in the day because they're hungry in first year or whatever. This regulation is also there's proof that this can be successful if we look at high-density places like China or Singapore that successfully enforce these laws and make sure that people behave well. So if we have the tax revenue to implement these regulations, we really mitigate most of your harms. Second of all, we have explained to you that we also on our side have more competition and an employee-driven market, which increases the locals' life quality in terms of finding a job that treats them better. We have also explained to you that there's a dual pricing system and little overlap in what the tourists and locals buy, which means that the locals will actually benefit from the tourists spending more again, and they will also just simply benefit from the money which is reinvested in their infrastructure and keeping their culture alive. Second of all, on economy, and how we win here on scale. You say there's still some tourism jobs, but let's look at it. If there's 1 of 100 people that still have a job and the rest no longer have jobs but face unemployment and uncertainty and fear, but no longer have noise complaints, this just does not weigh up to the most beneficial economy of tourism, which gives them all employment, which gives their state money, which stabilizes the prices for locals, and oftentimes, Dubrovnik finances the whole of Croatia's sanitation system with their tourism revenue. This is something we can only achieve on scale on our side. I think that is also the logical fallacy where you point out that locals pay taxes. No, the tourists are paying these taxes, and we need these tourist taxes to stabilize the life for the locals. Now, on the third clash, on the readaptation of these industries and the likelihood. You explain, you don't explain, you point out that they're likely to reshape and care for people. You have absolutely no mechanization on the alternative, although we told you throughout our first and third speech how there is no viable alternative that will reach up to the scale or be any better for the locals and for the environment. There's just no viable alternative in terms of geography and skills. We have explained this very thoroughly. On the fourth clash of infrastructure development and maintenance, I will weigh this on potential, because if we look at places like Bali and the Seychelles, you've portrayed them as having, at worst, a crowded hospital. We at least have the hospital on our side because we have the money from the tourists and the incentive to create this hospital for the tourists and the locals. So on our side, we exclusively have the high enough budget to invest in these things. And as I told you, with the scale, Dubrovnik really finances the whole nation's sanitation or healthcare. So this is something we really achieve on scale, and it is not enough if we significantly limit, if we have a significant limit on the money coming in here. Now in the last clash on environment, I think my third speaker has quite well explained that first of all, you completely lack the explanation and mechanization why your alternative is better, as she pointed out with the fishing or mining industry, or whichever other industry would be possible, although we have explained to you that no other industry is possible and viable to such a scale as tourism is, because there's a reason that the tourism, the major tourist destinations have focused specifically on tourism. You have also not addressed here the fear and uncertainty of the people, and you just point out that they might go somewhere else. Even if this happens, although it is extremely unlikely, you still have environmental harms because they're still going and being tourists somewhere and flying around the world. So really, at worst, on our case, it's symmetric. At best, we actually regulate many of these harms through our specific individual regulations. Wrapping up my speech, we limit harms, we don't limit people.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. I'm sure that we all want to live in a world where our grandchildren can still live in a planet that's not too hot and where the sky is blue and not grey. And their strategic mistake was firstly not really engaging on our point of climate change. And we flagged it in our first speech that is one of the most important metrics on why we win this debate. We told you in our second speech that the reason why people still travel to these major tourist destinations is because they're glorified in media and because they represent a social status. The reason why people want to go to Paris is because they want to prove to others that this is a really cool thing and I've done it too. When they cannot do it anymore, they're less likely to travel as much or to as expensive destinations further away because it's not worth it, because it's still expensive, but it doesn't bring them the same benefits. We proved to you why this will lead to less people traveling at least further distances, and people are more likely to travel domestically. This way, we're directly reducing the amount of people flying and directly combating climate change on our side of the house. And note, panel, that we never got any kind of pushback from their side of the house. We told you that on our side of the house, On top of just directly having less emissions of people flying, we also told you that these natural sites would be better off. In North Panel, we never got any kind of engagement on their side of the house. We told you twice about natural erosion. We told you about humidity, about carbon dioxide, that simply cannot be regulated through any other means. And note, no engagement whatsoever. We gave you examples about the La Salle caves in France, but I'm also going to tell you about how dolphins returned to Venice after they actually did these limits. I will also tell you how in Thailand, leatherback sea turtles have also returned because of these limits to tourism. So I urge the panel to actually care about this. This is one metric for us winning the debate, and we directly win this clash. But also to engage a bit more on their side about on which side of the house are actually locals better off. So on which side of the house is the economy somewhat better off. That is the main push from their side of the debate. They tell us that there will be so much unemployment and infrastructure will somehow collapse and so on, but we do not believe it. And we have already continuously tried to push and tell you that this is not likely, because just because we're cutting some amount of tourists doesn't mean, firstly, it doesn't mean that we're cutting off all. And this means that a large portion of those industry actors will still stay employed. And those who cannot work anymore in these industries are very likely to start catering to locals, because you still are profit driven, you still want to cater to locals. You might, the restaurants will still stand, but now you're going to sell to locals at a more reasonable price. And note panel, the only people that might actually suffer from slight restrictions to tourism is the rich landowners, the big corporations. This is the thing that we already told you in the first speech. We told you that these people that are already better off, more wealthy than others, are renting at such a high price to these local business owners that they care so much about their side of the house, that these owners must sell at an even higher price for them actually to get any benefit. On our side of the house, the comparative is that these really rich big corporations or landowners now have to slightly adjust their rent. They have to rent at a lower price so that actually these local business owners can afford them and still sell at a reasonable price for the locals, because they still have to cater towards them. And note, panel, that the people in these cities is very likely to still be relatively the same. Just because you have less tourists does not mean that you have less people in these cities. We still tell you that there's going to be most likely about the same, or at least the capacity that the city can hold of locals this time, because the locals have the principal right to live in these cities. We told you that they're the people that are paying taxes. They are the people that have to live there even when the tourists leave, with all the damage that caused. They are the people that have been building this city throughout generations. So, panel, we win on both clashes. We firstly proved to you why locals are better on our services, and we also proved to you why we are combating climate change, and that is the reason why we win this debate. So proud to propose. Thank you.